James Morrone, great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I always love an opportunity to talk about permitting and what it's getting wrong and how we can try to fix it.
Yeah, it's everybody's favorite topic. Well, speaking of that, you've got a new report out from earlier this year. I'd love to kind of dive into that and really get into some of the details here. But you've got a killer quote here I want to read to kind of tee us up. That is, the United States does not have an energy resource problem. We have a process problem. Electricity and energy demands are on the rise every day, and it is our red tape filled, broken permitting system that is keeping American energy on the sidelines. The thing that was really interesting when we talk about the permitting process is the emphasis on the words process. That's something that my team at Frontier Institute, and whenever we talk about this, we always be like, we have to use the words process because there's the permitting, there's the actual permitting, and then there's the permitting process. And your report really dives into the process aspect. So tell us a little bit about it. What did you guys find? What's it about? What does a permitting process itself even mean?
Yeah, happy to. So the report, A Guide to Unlocking Energy Abundance, the impact of permitting delays on access to energy and economic development. We dug into 6 states, and those states are Arizona, Montana, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and highlighted key energy projects that we previously took a look at in 2023, predating my time here, but we decided to take it back up because of the importance of permitting reform just in general. And we found not great things happening in the process. And frankly, the process is more broken than we thought. We found out at least the permitting process has cost us at least 50,000 new jobs and nearly 75 billion in estimated economic benefits. And the canceled projects alone account for around 4.2 billion in economic benefits and at least 38,000 temporary and permanent jobs alone. So we took a look around 30 projects across the 6 states. And as of right now, or at least at the time of the report, I haven't admittedly checked up on it too much just because of everything else going on with permitting reform in Congress. We found only 5 of the 30 projects are complete and operational. 7 were under construction and 6 were outright canceled. However, 2 of those canceled projects may be being revived. I believe 1 is in the permitting process in New York, the East Supply Enhancement Project, which is essentially a natural gas pipeline because New York is struggling with energy prices, but that's mostly because of their own doing. But I can go on a rant about New York any day of the week. I will have to check on the other project, but essentially the permitting process has become a choke point into how we can build everything related to energy, from generation, transmission, and anything in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that I really like about your guys' report is when we talk about the permitting process, it's kind of a wonky issue area that people have to kind of wrap their head around. But what you did here, which I really liked, is that you chose specific projects just to get like a finger on the pulse of the cost associated with these delays. These are, you could make the case that it's like a tax or it's inflationary in nature, where we should have these projects. These are, that would make energy cheaper or any variety of things. We can kind of get into some of those details in a minute, but we don't have them. We don't have them because of this process and the way it's been an issue. So one of the big things that you mentioned is the National Environmental Policy Act. Will you unpack that a little bit?
Yes, NEPA, our big nemesis. And the problem is NEPA is a procedural tool following the Supreme Court decision and the 7 counties decision. But prior to that, it was always viewed as the primo environmental review. It predates the Clean Air Act and predates the majority of environmental regulations that we have. And it was essentially designed to be a thumbs up, thumbs down for federal agencies reviewing projects that enter a federal review jurisdiction. So if a project isn't crossing state lines, FERC and other federal agencies that would be involved would have to review it. Or if a project is located on federal land or being leased by federal land, such as drilling or fracking or something like that, federal agencies like BLM would be responsible for it. So essentially how NEPA works is if a project triggers NEPA, which is a major federal action, essentially as it's defined, federal agencies would be required to go through an environmental review. So that's why you see very long environmental impact statements. And over time, the reason they got longer and longer is because there was no real, I guess there wasn't a defined scope on how NEPA is supposed to work, how the reviews are supposed to work. So over time, they kept growing, they kept growing, they kept growing, and thus making these reviews longer and essentially endless. Then you add in the lawsuits that are permitted. There's always a public commentary, there's a public notification period. And unfortunately, the way NEPA was originally allowed, the standing for lawsuits against such projects that are being reviewed under NEPA is quite large. I think it's up to 6 years after final approval. You still have law. You can file suit, and on top of that, you can file suits many times in over variation of things, whether it's environmental issues or if it's a procedural issue. So you could file two different lawsuits challenging a project, and they both can be considered, and they both can gum up the project.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of aspects and a
yeah,
lot
that's
of
I think one thing that we often, talking to friends who don't want to hear about the permitting process, but I can't help myself, is I'll point out, I'll be like, oh, this forest project got stopped. It's in court right now, and they'll go, well, I thought that would already happen. And I said, it did. It happened a couple of years ago. We're back at it again with the same situation. Well, and one thing that, kind of a good way that I like to explain NEPA, and by the way, we have in the Montana Environmental Policy Act a state level NEPA, a little NEPA, if you will. And that is that, once, like you said, once the state action is triggered, whatever that definition might be, or a lack of definition in many cases, they have to go and analyze the environmental impact of that before taking that action. Well, that is the most open-ended definition that you could possibly have. It really is, we call it NEPA or NEPA unclarity. We don't have any clarity on what this actually means. And so it opens the door to litigants, and in often case, they don't have the best intentions. One of the things that you bring up here is Montana. I think you have a couple projects here in Montana. I'd love to hear a little bit about them, if there's any that you'd like to highlight, and just kind of give us an idea of what some of these project delays and the cost of them have been.
Yeah, these projects are all over the place. They're both fossil fuel, they're solar. I'm sorry, not solar, they're renewable. They vary across transmission and energy infrastructure and generation. So, for example, we could always touch on the Keystone Pipeline, but no one needs to rehash that anymore. I think we're all
pipeline
good with how that ended. We're not good, but we all kind of understand how that went. But you have a hydro pump storage project. This started in 2013, or the process started for 2013, and it's had to submit several license applications, several extensions. So it's unclear if this is ever either going to come to fruition or even going to be constructed. Or you could do the North Plains Connector project, which is a simple electricity transmission project, 420-mile high voltage direct current transmission line from central North Dakota to Montana. So essentially bringing energy generated in North Dakota to Montana and vice versa, what has connected the state's electricity grids and really reduce the strain that either state could be facing, and adds a little more reliability and reduces some of the congestion, right? So let's say you want to build a data center out there, it'd be a lot easier to handle that new demand with such a transmission line in place, because the grids can better coordinate with each other, whether they're in an RTO or not. I don't remember in that case. I'd have to double check. But essentially, that project's not even done. It's still in the permitting process, and the review process started in 2013. As of last we checked, they're hoping to secure the final process approvals this year in 2026, begin construction in 2028, and hopefully they begin in 2032, as long as they didn't face any hangups, construction delays, state processing delays, or even lawsuits like we cited earlier. It's the problem with the current process permitting system is that it doesn't provide any kind of predictability, and that makes it impossible for a developer to properly budget. And if they can't budget, they'll either kill a project, or it'll raise the cost so exponentially to the point where those costs are eventually put onto the ratepayer, you and me. So essentially, we pay the bill at the end of the day, no matter what, whether it's higher rates or the lack of electricity, which results in the higher rates. We're still getting the short end of the stick either way.
Yeah, we were a nation of builders for a very long time. Whether it's Hoover Dam, Golden Gate Bridge, or Statue of Liberty, obviously we were gifted that, but we put it together. There are a lot of things that we built over time, and I think it still might be the record. We have the largest earthen dam in North America in Montana, the Fort Peck Dam, and that was a marvel that they were able to build. It's huge, but the critique that we're seeing is that we can't build these same projects anymore. And if we want to modernize our grid, our aging infrastructure, if we want to address ballooning costs on producing energy, then we need to address some of those. So in your report, it says for Montana, at stake is 5 major projects that you looked at, nearly 1,100 jobs, and roughly $6 billion in economic benefits. Is that a pretty similar picture to other states?
Yeah, roughly speaking, it varies state to state depending on the project. And the kicker is this is only based off the information that's publicly available by these projects themselves. So we can't, or we don't have the ability to estimate how much the revenue can be created based off that. That is a little bit out of our wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So we go by those numbers roughly. And sometimes they don't even publicize those numbers, or if they were, they're no longer available. So we'll have to roughly estimate based off what's still available, old articles, etc. And still, that's just the rough estimates. It could be even more than that for all we know because of the indirect impacts to it. So there could have been, let's say, one of these projects were completed and all those construction workers put more money into the economy. That's an indirect impact right there, and extra revenue for the state on top of the revenue coming from the transmission line directly. So it's just a dual loss that could be easily avoided if we fix these processes. And there's so many ways to fix these at the state and federal level.
Yeah. I'm proud to say Montana has done a lot of reforms, and we still got some more work to do on our permitting process. We'll probably get into some solutions here in a little bit. But before we do, maybe it would be worthwhile to walk folks through, let's say I wanted to build, let's do a transmission line or something like that. What is this? This isn't like for the most part, this isn't like the substantive laws of like, I can't pollute or I can't steal people's property. What is this process of going through NEPA for this look like? What are our steps that then lead to a lawsuit at the end?
Well, to start, if it's a big enough project, or if it's going to trigger anything federal, it's going to be crossing state lines. Yep. So it's going to be from Montana to somewhere else, or from somewhere else to Montana. So pick a state where it could start, and it has to pass through either one or multiple states and either end or begin in Montana. So maybe there's something generating electricity, Montana is shipping it out, or Montana's taking in the electricity because to help lower prices, or the utility found a deal, or depending on however that works. Mm-hmm. So first steps are filing applications with the relevant agencies. So because if I understand correctly, BLM still owns some land in Montana.
Oh yes, they own quite a bit.
They most likely would be the lead agency. So you'd have to you start your filings with the BLM, and there may be other federal agencies that will require, depending on the type of project, where it would go through. Maybe the EPA would be involved if it's going over some kind of protected lands or near protected land, or there may be a downstream. Then you'll have to go through FERC, the Federal Energy Regulations Commission. I always mess up that acronym. I shouldn't at this point, but I always just call it FERC. So you have to go through FERC. So you have to get their approval as well, because anything crossing state lines in this energy is their domain. So then you have to figure out who the main agency is. So it could be both of them providing a review, and those could be 2 separate timelines on their own. Then on top of that, there's the state reviews, and oftentimes they're quite duplicative. Like you said, there's a state NEPA, and sometimes they're asking the same questions over the same issues. And even though you can get the same answer from the federal government, you can get a different one from the state government. Montana's, for the most part, is pretty good. So they're typically going to lean, for the most part, on the federal government, unless there's something very state specific involved, from what I can understand. So if there's something culturally relevant to Montana, if there's a tribe, that also would add in something else as well. If there's a Native American tribe that has a stake in the land, or is part of a reservation, or may impact a cultural hotspot or culturally important location, they could also be involved, and that adds extra layers as well. And then they have to put together the environmental impact statements, draft statements, and it takes a lot of time. And from there, you wait on the review. If you're lucky, under this administration, they're fast tracking a lot of things, and there's the Fast Track 41 authority, which is under the federal review process, and that very much speeds up the process as it stands right now. It kind of streamlines it and kind of sets somewhat predictable dates for agencies, and it creates an easier tracking system for developers. But not every project gets that. It typically has to be classified as a major project or something, unless it's specifically designated by the administration or the Federal Permitting Council, or however you kind of want to make that work. And then however long it takes for the council to get a federal agency to get through the review, could be years. Roughly the average is 4 to 5 years as it stands right now, based off a McKinsey study from last year. But it varies depending on the type of project, how in depth it is, how extensive it is. So there's the variation there.
You mentioned,
sorry. And once you finally get through all of the layers and you finally get approval, then there's a 6-year window where you can then face a lawsuit. And those lawsuits can come from really anybody. Maybe it's a landowner who feels that their land is improperly being taken via eminent domain, or is purchased improperly, or you could sue on the procedural grounds saying they didn't take into consideration X, Y, and Z, or what have you. Or you could say this is going to be harmful to the environment in this way or this way. Doesn't really matter, but then you have those lawsuits that you can have to tend to deal with as well.
You mentioned environmental analysis. Can you give us a little look at like what's in this analysis? I know there's environmental assessment, environmental impact statement, there's categorical exclusions, there's a couple different levels of analysis. But what are in them? Like, if we were to look at these documents, what do we see inside of these documents?
Hundreds of pages of everything, essentially. So really, you could see what the impact to a small stream would be if it's relevant. You could see what happened to the dirt or the land, to bird populations if it's an above ground transmission line. It varies. It depends on each project, but you'll get, just to kind of summarize what you're going to get, it's essentially an overview or a review of how the line is going to impact local wildlife populations, any kind of downstream effects, specific downstream effects now. There used to be a much wider scope, but that scope's been narrowed, like I said, by the 7 counties decision. So agencies can now only really assess direct impacts and not downstream of what potentially could happen. So that scope's been fortunately narrowed, because as you can understand, that expands what can be challenged and what can't be. But essentially just really finding the direct impacts of, let's say, this transmission line would have on the local environment.
One thing that you said, at the start of our conversation that I thought was a really good kind of recap is this was originally intended, NEPA and MEPA for that matter in Montana, was intended to give government kind of they call it the look before you leap law. And, its original intent was, in some respects noble. I think they failed to define a lot of things that were super, super important. But because we don't have clear definitions, especially federally, what happens is that they have to look at more and more and more things. And so, for example, here in Montana, we had a couple court cases, and it was the Laurel natural gas power plant here. And they had multiple court cases popping up around that. But one of them was whether or not they analyzed the lighting. And that was something that it's not regulated. It's not something that anyone really expected to have to do an environmental analysis on, how the lighting in a city that has refineries lighting up 24/7, how a small little power plant is going to boost that. And I think it's a good case study of when we fail to define things, it's just going to continue to grow and grow. What's going to be in these analysis? You go from 50 pages originally to hundreds, if not thousands of pages sometimes as well. But can you give us a little background potentially on I think it's the 7 counties decision on what the impact is? If you know anything about the case, great. But otherwise, just some information about it would be really useful.
Yeah, so it was a decision last year, and it was arguably really a monumental decision, especially post Chevron. And I'm sure you've talked about the Chevron decision on this show, so I'll spare us all the detail there. But essentially, it narrowed how far an agency can use NEPA reviews. So instead of how it previously was, where let's say this factory is or this generation facility is being built, and it's being built on this river or creek. Instead of seeing what happened could be the direct impact of this creek, it could also have the flow down, like what happens down the creek in this town or this wildlife area that's somewhat connected to it or somewhat reliant. So the scope was essentially wide as a net regulator could find or believe it was relevant, or forced to review it based off a lawsuit. So the 7 counties decision essentially put a hard line of how far you can review it, making sure the review only finds the direct impacts from the energy project at hand and limits some of what can be later litigated against. So that very much clarified essentially overall that NEPA is a procedural statute, not this wide encompassing statute that it essentially became under agency deference. So using those principles of the Chevron decision, narrowing how NEPA can be applied and implemented.
Absolutely, yeah. It became NEPA for a while there became a catch-all for everything, and really did open the door to what we call kind of a veto-ocracy, where if people don't like X, Y, or Z, they could be literally one person who just happens to not like, let's say natural gas power plants, not because of health or safety or anything like that. They just don't like them. And if they have enough money to get a lawyer, they can sue to continue to delay a project outright. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the legislative solutions that you've outlined here, specifically this SPEED Act. We've heard a little bit about it. You want to tell us, give us the scoop about what it is?
Yeah, the SPEED Act is a great bill, a bipartisan bill that came out of the House from Reps Westerman and Golden. And it worked to essentially clean up the permitting process with NEPA reform and judicial reform, because everybody essentially agreed on both the left and the right that this is a key issue. The NEPA, as we've talked about, is just become this brutal choke point. But essentially, the SPEED Act creates these consistent and predictable timelines under NEPA now, ensures a much more responsive and essential review, so the agencies can't really drag their feet anymore. Thought that was me.
I don't know.
I don't know. Why is my computer doing this?
Continue.
Yeah, no problem. It simplifies the NEPA documents and lessens the burdens on both agencies and the applying parties, so developers have an easier and less tedious process overall. And it also clarifies the NEPA trigger by defining the requirements of what a federal action is, and also limits judicial limitations. So instead of having those 6 years and essentially unlimited standing to file suit, it's much more narrow. You have to be essentially directly impacted or be in the area of what's going to be impacted by a project. And so that's something you hear all the time. I was at a conference earlier this year at the Bipartisan Policy Center's Permitting Reform Summit. And even some of the big premier left of center environmental groups saying we can't even do cleanup actions until we got permitting reform. And they got stopped from doing that, which is baffling. To me, at least, where you're saying no to someone who could fix things for you without you paying for it or us paying for it, and that's still getting said no to. It's crazy.
I absolutely
it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. This is the one area in which I think pretty much everybody's on board, left, right, and center, except for a very small group of folks that love being able to use it to veto things that they don't like. And one thing folks don't necessarily understand, because sometimes I talk to people, and depending on their political alignment, whether right or left, they'll go, oh, well, I don't like that because of this, or I don't like this because of that. And one of the things that is, the right is like, we want to increase energy production, whether it's natural gas or, at Frontier Institute, we like all of the energy. We think we should have all of it, nuclear, you name it. But On the left, the big thing that they'd like to do is they want more green energy projects. That's kind of their big thing. And MEPA, NEPA, and all the state environmental policy acts are very much limiting states' abilities to be able to build out the green energy that they'd like to do, which is, unfortunate. But not only that, I think the one that kind of overlaps all of that is forest management projects. It's a huge issue here in Montana. One of the reasons why we have forests that are unhealthy kind of goes back in a long-winded story, essentially, that we had a zero tolerance policy for a long time from the federal government, saying that we were going to put out every fire by 10 a.m. the day after it's reported. And we all know that fires are beneficial to landscapes, especially out west. And over time, that made forests denser and denser and denser. And we've, as a Montanan, we go outside all the time and hiking and backpacking and skiing. And some of the forests, I'm like, this is bad. Like, this is a tinderbox waiting to go up. This is easily 50 to 100 years build up of fuel that should have been periodically kind of cleared out by forest fires. But we know that these forest projects are going to make habitat for wildlife better. It's going to make our forests healthier. And ultimately, it's going to be good for the environment. But we can't even do these forest management projects because of this process. The whole thing is just kind of a wild situation in the first place.
Yeah. Montana's not the only one that suffers from it. California, we obviously know, has had great success in starting their own forest fires by just bad policies, unfortunately. But the reality is, we, for some reason, moved away from controlled burns because they were viewed as environmentally harmful. And the alternative is far worse, where they're both larger fires and people are losing everything and causing insurance rates to skyrocket. I know I'm citing more California because it's obviously all in the news, and
they're the textbook example of what not to do.
I mean, there's so many reasons and things about that state and their energy and environmental policy of what not to do. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a noble cause. And even with permitting reform, I always stress it. We're not getting rid of environmental processes. They are still happening. They're still as in depth as they are. It is just much more narrow. It's much more predictable. There's better timelines. There's better communication. And it's not allowing for borderline frivolous lawsuits that only benefit people with billable hours. So essentially, we're really trying to just cut down on the waste and the unnecessary waste of time and money that essentially we all pay for, while still trying to provide this energy that we all need to meet growing demand, whether it's from AI and data centers or just general electrification of the grid, and everything we use that is electronic, whether it's a phone, a car, Samsung fridges that now give you ads, all of the above.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I like to talk about is the nuance, I think, between the federal National Environmental Policy Act and the state level Montana Environmental Policy Act. And that basically is we as a state function as more of a permitting authority than the federal government. The federal government definitely permits things. They definitely have state actions they have to go through. But in states, we have this, permitting process, MEPA, but we also have substantive permitting regulations. And those, they kind of overlap a little bit, but not exactly. So a good example would be mining. We have all kinds of mining laws in Montana that protect water, that protect pretty much every type of environmental impact you could ever have from a mine. And if we change our Montana Environmental Policy Act, we don't change those regulations, those substantive regulations that say you can't pollute, or you can't poison the water, or you can't kick the can down the road on remediating an old mine. That doesn't change just because we do our environmental analysis. And to say that those things are going to change is a little bit a little dishonest, I think, from some folks, definitely here in Montana as well too. So going back to the SPEED Act, I had a question for you. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you had and kind of the key points on your report is that for the SPEED Act simplifies NEPA documents and lessens burdens on agencies. And one critique that I've had from people that they want to reform NEPA and MEPA, but one of the big things they say is, well, what we actually need is to have more analysis. We need to have better analysis. We need to have longer analysis. And that makes it so that we can stand these analysis up in court and say, no, look, we followed the law. What's your response to that?
That's a good critique, but just because it's longer doesn't mean it's necessarily better. That I couldn't really agree with that understanding of it. You can still have a good, thorough critique. We're not saying this has to be done in 20 minutes or 30 days or 60 days approval. That would be too fast, even especially depending on the project. But what we're trying to do is find the right balance. Not every project that involves a federal agency needs to go through a multi-year review. So it's clarifying what projects need such reviews and then making sure they go through the proper reviews, making sure the right agencies. It's not that they're going through bad reviews or they're cutting corners by any means. It would be more like solidifying under one agency, so more of a consolidation. So instead of six agencies all doing their independent reports, there's one lead agency consulting with all the agencies and still producing a in-depth review, but using half the time because it cuts out overlapping and redundancy. So that's really the point of that we're trying to do with permitting form. It's not cutting down on the review time, it's streamlining parts that can improve the efficiency of the review while still maintaining that robust standard that protects the environment. Because at the end of the day, we all need to protect the environment still. We're not going back to the 1840s where everything was black smoke coming out of the factories like it's a Charles Dickens novel, all right? We're not going down that road. I grew up in New York State and took 50 plus years to go in the Hudson. You still don't really want to go swimming or eating fish out of the Hudson still. So no one wants to go back to that world, and we're not going to go back to this world by just reforming the permitting process.
Yeah, I think it's acknowledging that there is a middle ground here. It's that no, we don't want to pollute, that we don't want to have our environment impacted, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we have to build things. We can't just say this is enough. We aren't going to have anything else ever again. And when buildings or infrastructure collapses, then so be it. We won't rebuild it. That's not realistic either side. There's got to be a middle ground here, and I think that's what we're trying to get at. One
And
kind of
just add to
analogy.
it, think about all the older facilities that are either natural gas or coal. They're more inefficient, they don't produce as much, and they probably pollute more. So by stopping more efficient and newer facilities, you're making the emissions problem just as worse if that's your overall goal as well. So it's cutting the nose to spite the face.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the analogies that I use to kind of really bring home this kind of ethereal topic is imagine that you're a guy who's got to go out and mow his lawn, and he goes to go out and mow his lawn, and before he's able to do that, he has somebody come up to him and say, "Hey, well, have you analyzed what that's going to do to property values?" And then somebody else comes up and goes, "Well, before you do that, you should really analyze where are you going to put your grass clippings? Are they going to impact the flow of the river downstream, or really, what is you using new blades on your lawnmower going to impact global markets for steel?" And you could go on and on and on and on. And to say that they can't cut their lawn before analyzing every single possible thing is absurd. And no one believes that. Now, do we think that there is some middle ground where, yeah, should somebody who's mowing their lawn go and take their entire lawnmower and chuck it in the river or set it on fire in the middle of the street? No, we definitely need some sort of regulations to address that. But to think that we needed open-ended procedural laws where we just say, just look at stuff and don't stop looking until we say you're done is absurd.
Yeah, it's all coming down to a balance. There are better ways to do it faster, but still safe. That's essentially what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's simple and sweet. Short. I like that. Okay, so let's get into the next part here that I was very curious to hear about. That is the Permit Act. This one is a little bit more nuanced, I think, in my opinion, than the Speed Act. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, the Permit Act is much more on the Clean Water Act, and that's a bit, like you said, a bit more nuanced, and it's much more focused on the Environmental Protection Agency rather than NEPA. It is essentially requiring the EPA to consider the cost and availability of water treatment, so more economic standards involved, as well as allowing the EPA administrator to issue permits more nationally. It clarifies and redefines the triggers around definition of navigable waters and essentially works to reduce the backlog of Clean Water Act permissions. So essentially, if you recall, there is a whole court case around the waters of the United States and what is navigable, what is not, what is under permit, is this tributary under federal protection of the EPA. So essentially, it clarifies what is actually under the waters of the United States and actually clarifies the authority of what the EPA has to regulate. So instead of relying on court decisions and constant up fights on what is and what isn't essentially federally under federal jurisdiction, it creates a very clear background like, okay, this is it, this is under federal jurisdiction, this is not, let's move. So it essentially clears and clarifies how the system works and how the process works, and creates a very crystal clear definition that allows an easier review. And like I said, it keeps the review process in place.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think I can kind of bring home to our Montana audience here, and that is here in your documents, it says requires EPA to consider costs and availability of treatment technology. You'd already said that, but one of the things that we have had playing out here in Montana is phosphate and nitrogen levels in our water, and whether like who's responsible for it. And without getting myself in too much trouble here and picking a side to kind of lay out exactly what's going on is the environmental groups say, well, hey, nitrogen and phosphates are too high. Yeah, it's one of, I know it's nitrogen for sure, are too high in our water, and what we need to do is reduce that. And so they say, okay, well, the permitting way to go about that is point source discharge, basically for treated water. And a few different folks do treated water. So if a mine uses water, they'll have to have a treatment plant, and then they'll treat their water before releasing it back into the river. Same with cities and towns. And what they're basically saying is that, well, you guys have to get better at doing that, because there's still these pollutants, essentially fertilizer is really what it is, in the water that are causing algae blooms. It was a big fight for years here. And then the third group, which quite frankly kind of wants to stay out of the conversation, is especially because there's no permitting to like kind of point back to, and that is our ag community. And they obviously use fertilizer, and sometimes that runs off into the water there too. And so there's these different groups kind of fighting. But what you see play out is that the cities and the towns here in Montana are making the argument that, hey, we actually have gone above and beyond. We are using the gold standard, the best available reduction of nitrogen in our water that we could possibly have, but you want us to do better. There's no way scientifically that we can do better unless we want to bankrupt our entire state to do something like that. And so adding this kind of analysis to the EPA, especially with water treatment, can be a huge bonus, because we're not just operating in the land of like, what ifs, I wish this would happen. We're operating in reality to, yes, there's a gold standard here, and it's in relation to our ability to achieve it. It might take a little bit of time to get there, but we need to have that kind of calculation. So that's super interesting. Is there any other permitting reforms going through Congress right now that you'd highlight?
Not off the top of my head. I know they're negotiating in the Senate. The Speed Act and the Permit Act did pass the House. They've hit snags over political disagreements over the cancellation of wind projects earlier this year, but they are moving forward now. There are legitimate actual negotiations ongoing. So I don't know if there's any new text. I'm hoping every day some text drops so we can actually see if it's good and push it through, because you never know. But there's a lot of things over crowding the Congress's attention right now. So you never know. But I know there's a couple of transmission bills being worked on, which do touch on some reviews by, I believe, Senator Hickenlooper, and some Senate Democrats dropped some legislation today that I've just started reviewing. And I believe there's earlier from Senator Welch and another Republican. I believe it was Senator McCormick in Pennsylvania, but I'd have to double check. So those are two transmission focused pieces, but also work to clean up the backlog and kind of fix the permitting process. For example, the McCormick Welch bill would work on expanding categorical exclusions, even though it may not fix NEPAs itself, but it would make it easier to build transmission projects, which is a really big issue right now in the energy development space.
Absolutely. That was one of the bills that Frontier Institute led on, and expanding categorical exclusions here in Montana so that we can have programmatic reviews and categorical exclusions for things. And so we've actually used it quite a bit. And we recently were able to learn that the programs that started using they kind of have a hybrid approach, but the programs that were able to start using a categorical exclusion checklist for programmatic reviews, what a mouthful, they have been able to reduce their processing time by about 40%. So it's been pretty substantial that they've been able to go through that. They're not cutting corners. We're not, they're not going out there and saying we're not going to review this thing. But they know, hey, this is a pretty standardized thing. We have to look for this. We have to look for that. That could be a risk. They do all those things and they keep moving, as opposed to having this open-ended thing where we just analyze till the cows come home.
Yeah, consistency and predictability is the name of the game. If you add more of that into a process, it's easier to manage, it's easier to navigate, and it's easier to build. And that's the end goal.
Absolutely. Well, James, I really appreciate your time. How can people learn more about this and this report that you have out and your other work, if there's anything else floating out there too?
Yeah, you can always check out americansforprosperity.org/policy corner. That's where you can check out all my other hits, some of my blog posts, and as well as our entire policy team's focus from spending and budgeting, healthcare, energy. Name a policy issue and we could talk about it for hours there. So take a look there. You could always follow me on Twitter at James_Morrone, but fair warning, it's pretty much all hockey focused at the current time. And my hockey team is disappointing me. So be warned, it is not the most positive hockey sports takes right now.
That's all right. Sometimes we need to get our heads out of policy and get back to the real world here. So James Morrone Jr., I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And everyone have a great one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.